Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Nationalism versus globalism and sort of this, trend that we've seen, of late, that we're not as connected as we once were, and we're maybe separating out to more separate nations or blocks of nations or whatnot, is really a trend that I think a lot of people have become concerned about. And I read this really interesting article by David Polansky, and I wanted to get him on our show to talk about nationalism. David Polansky holds a PhD in political science from the University of Toronto, where he studies focused on the history of political thought and the development of modern nationalism. He writes on a variety of topics and has been published in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Globe and Mail, Foreign Policy, and everywhere. And we're going to talk tonight about nationalism. Is it something that has grown over the last little while, and why, and what do we do about it, if anything, or can we? David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit about nationalism, and is it a political phenomenon in the world today?
Yeah, it certainly is. But it's one of those things. It is maybe a bit like that old joke about the two fish, who are swimming along, and then they encounter an older fish, and the older fish says, "Morning, guys, how's the water?" And they keep swimming, and then one of them says to the other one, "What the hell is water?" It is everywhere, and it is really sort of the backdrop and the ordering principle for most of the world we live in. And at the same time, because it's so fundamental, we only tend to really notice it. We only tend to notice it when something sort of goes awry, or there's a sort of a spike or a dramatic instance of violence or conflict, and suddenly it seems like, oh, that's nationalism. But in a way, that's something more like, I guess we're using another metaphor, that's more like the peak, the peak of an iceberg above the water. We don't see it because it's everywhere, and yet it has these dramatic effects that can suddenly make it seem suddenly very apparent to us, as it probably has in the past couple.
So you think we've always had nationalism? It's just that for some reason we're seeing the peak of the iceberg a little bit more today?
I don't want to say we've always had nationalism, but I would say that in a fundamental way that it is part of the ordering. It's one of the ordering principles of the modern world and of the modern state system. So I don't want to say that human beings have always had nationalism per se, although you could say that human beings have always had some form of what you might call particularism. It's just that it doesn't have to take a national form. It can be a religion, it can be a city state, it can be like the Godfather, saying, I love you, Fredo, but don't ever take sides against the family again. There are a variety of kind of attachments we can have. The national attachment is just a very key one in our modern world, because it is the key political form of attachment that we have. If that makes sense.
More than an ideology. So you think nationalism is more of a connection than I'm a left-wing liberal progressive versus I'm a right-wing Christian conservative or something like that?
It can be. It's not that it's necessarily more fundamental in terms of one's personal and subjective feelings. That can obviously depend on the person. I mean, there are people who are clearly more attached to their political ideologies than they are to the country of which they're a citizen. But I would say that those ideologies will have to, tend to sort of be ephemeral in the absence of a concrete political structure to support them. This is why nationalism is in many ways so powerful, because there's always either a real political structure, which is the state, or one that you're trying to create if you're one of those kinds of nationalists, in the interest of creating a state that doesn't exist yet. During the Cold War, something like what you're talking about was more potent, because one could be not a nationalist of one's own state, but strongly, say, left-wing, strongly attached to an ideology of global communism, which at least there did, but that still had, this vast apparatus, beginning with the Soviet Union itself, to sort of channel and direct those energies. We don't quite have that today, so we've fallen back more on nationalism, I would say.
So do you think that it has grown? We've fallen back on nationalism more today?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, because the sort of what you might call the challenges to nationalism, of which the great challenge was something like global communism, that ended up getting filtered through the nation state, and this was something that Marxists began to grapple with someone like a Benedict Anderson wrote a very famous book called Imagine Communities, where one of the things he's doing is telling other Marxists, like, nationalism is real. And it's in many ways realer than the Marxism, because this is where everyone ends up. This is where everyone ends up. We end up being Marxist of our particular nation state. And now, in a sense, since the end of the Cold War, Marxism-Leninism fell apart. And there was this kind of idea, oh, maybe we can just have a kind of non-communist, non-radical globalism, but that never quite took shape. Whereas underneath all of that, the basic contours of the nation state were still there. And we live in a world of nation states, or presumptive nation states. And that's what gives nationalism its kick.
So I was at a global economics conference today, and they talked about one of the big trends being decoupling, and that isolationism and decoupling between the United States and China primarily, but frankly, all around the world, was one of the largest negatives to economic growth, and it was described as a negative. So therefore, I got to ask you the question: is nationalism bad or good, or is it just a reality?
I mean, it's kind of like saying, is your mother bad or good? Like, what kind of mom did you have? Like what you like. You can't, there's simply no way to say it's bad or good, because it's just everywhere. We all have it. It can take bad or good forms. I mean, and use the example of, you use the example of, the feeling of economists and the concern that this kind of nationalism will clamp down on, global prosperity. But, no less than Adam Smith, very famously, he said that one of the wisest things that Great Britain ever did was create the Navigation Acts, where they basically told the world that if you want to come and use our ports, and you have to use our ships. And they did this to smash Dutch shipping. That was an act of economic nationalism, because they prioritized the good of the state, or the nascent state, over that of, global free trade. And Adam Smith himself said, no, that was smart. That was the way to go. At the end of the day, we are probably political animals more than we're economic animals, which is not to say we don't need to eat. So obviously there are forms of autarky. I mean, I don't think you would want to be North Korea, but it's a tricky question. And I think it has to be answered at the level of judgment and policy. I realize that's an unsatisfying answer.
Well, but I guess what you're saying is it's just reality. And so trying to make sure that the nationalistic instincts that either your country or your organization or you have are for positive, just like, the mom is a good mom. So you got to try to make sure nationalism is good. So I got to ask you, and we'll talk about this a lot more, I presume, later on after the break. But what we've seen just this past week with the rise of Hamas against Israel, what we've seen, in the last 2 years with Russia and Ukraine, aren't we seeing a return to nationalism that we haven't seen in 100 years or 75 years?
It's hard to say a return, because this is just one of those sort of questions where it's like, where does the quantitative become qualitative? I mean, during the 90s, right off the end of the Cold War, we saw tremendous bloodletting between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh then. You saw tremendous bloodletting in the Balkans as Yugoslavia began disintegrated. You saw tremendous bloodletting between, which was a quasi-nationalist, I would argue, dispute between Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda. And that was all just in a handful of years after the end of the Cold War. So I'm not sure I'm comfortable saying that the last, which admittedly very turbulent few years, represents a qualitative shift. I would simply say that it represents spiking forms of instability within a broadly nationalist framework, but not ones we haven't exactly seen before, I would say.
Those three examples you gave were all terrible, there's no question, but they were all reasonably isolated. Francis Fukuyama said it was the end of history and, the end of the Cold War. The Washington Consensus had won. And there was sort of neoliberalism, capitalism, democracy spreading around the world and not, I don't know what the opposite of decoupling is, coupling. There was global trade. And there were people that thought the World Economic Forum was fantastic and that globalization was fantastic and that the United Nations was fantastic. There was certainly during the 90s and the early years of the 2000s an incredible growth in global trade. And I would have thought that would have been the pinnacle of globalization and the opposite of nationalization, no?
Yeah, the 90s were great. I like the 90s too. But one way to put that would be to say that, the 90s were good for the people that the 90s were good for. And I mean, look, Fukuyama, to his credit, does acknowledge that the end of history is going to be a long process. It's not going to happen like that. Other people felt that way because the 90s were, in fact, so good. He allowed it to take hundreds of years. And one of his arguments is that nationalism will decline because it's a form of a desire for collective recognition that people ultimately won't need as global democratic capitalism allows them to pursue, to just go about their own pursuits without requiring that kind of recognition at the level of the nation. Is that true? That's a big question. But one thing I would say is it's more true when things are going well. And the story that you've just told sounded a lot better before, for example, before we gave China most favored nation status. It sounded a lot better, before the Gini coefficient looked a lot worse now than it did then. And it never probably sounded that compelling to, for example, anyone in Gaza. So in a way, what we're seeing, I think, are things coming to the surface that we can understand as always having been there. Another way to put that would be to say that the success of that project does still hinge upon prudential management on the part of leaders. And you can argue that our leaders have not prudentially managed their resources and their assets and their good fortune over the past 20 plus years.
They have not managed it well.
Yeah.
And that's led to more nationalism.
It certainly has created more opportunities for nationalism to arise in fairly unpleasant ways.
Or is it that some leaders wanting power use nationalism as a way of gaining that power?
That's no question. That's always no question, and that will always be available. But I want to point out that that availability isn't some kind of weird tribal or atavistic thing. It's always there for democracies as well. Because the whole point of a democracy is we elect our leaders, and they're our leaders because they're answerable to us. Then you have to, well, who's the us? The us is not all 8 billion people in the world. The us has to be a finite group of citizens. And then you start saying, well, who's that? So one way or another, liberal democracy itself is going to invite the question of nationalism, if that makes sense.
Unless we have some sort of global democracy and the European Union becomes a far more stronger institution.
Unless you have a global Leviathan. That's right.
Fascinating conversation we're going to have tonight on nationalism with David Polansky, University of Toronto academic. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is David Polansky. He's got a PhD in political science from the University of Toronto. His studies is focused on the history of political thought and the development of modern nationalism. And he's written recently about this topic. And I thought, frankly, given what's going on in Eastern Europe, what's going on in the Middle East, frankly, what's going on in the United States, it would be really interesting to chat with David about some of these issues. David, with the name Polansky, I presume you're Polish. Is that correct?
I guess there's no relation to the director. I have to emphasize. Actually, I guess they would really be Russia, which is now, but although it would now be part of Lithuania if I have the geography right.
Okay.
At the time it would have been Russia when they left. Although my mother's family is from southern Italy. I'm very much an American style mongrel, which may be one of the reasons I myself am not much of a nationalist.
I was just wondering about the SKY, which I thought was typically Polish. I've had previously some dealings with a lot of Polish and Ukrainian people because I used to be married to one that was one of both. And it was fascinating to me because the Poles and the Ukrainians, they shared so much of the same food, so much of the same traditions. The language, the writing of the language was different, but the pronunciation of the language was very similar. It was like Dziękuję and Dziękuję were the two different pronunciations of thank you, and Zdrowie and something similar to that were the cheers. But yet for thousands of years they hated each other, and you couldn't marry one or the other, even though there was a lot of intermarriage, and the borders went back and forth. And then you talked about the Balkans and the Croats versus the Serbs, and I could talk about a similar story. Nationalism to me sounds like sometimes it's just a way of getting a smaller group that can get the resources and have some benefit in economics. because it doesn't make a lot of logical sense. Because some of those people that are the most nationalistic against others are pretty damn similar to the others.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's certainly true. That's certainly true. And there, there is the sort of, the hatred, I guess, that proximity brings. It's certainly, it's one, so it's one thing, to feel that there are people across the world who are different than you. But, my neighbor has 2 cows and I have 1 cow, and that's that's intolerable. There is some of that. But I do want to emphasize that it can be too easy to sort of ascribe these sort of ancestral hatreds here that didn't really exist in a meaningful sense. I think it's probably human nature to prefer, this is what Socrates calls the love of one's own. And I think that's natural. And it starts with the family. I prefer my own kids as much as they annoy me. If I can only rescue one people's kids, they're going to be my kids, not someone else's kids. This is the natural love of one's own, and it can end up distinguishing itself in all kinds of, as you point out, petty ways. These people who seem similar, but they consider themselves different. But that's not to say that they're necessarily going to find themselves fighting over resources or what have you. It requires a political framework for that to happen. And this is why, for example, we've not tended to see that kind of ethnic conflict under imperial conditions. Empires actually manage diversity fairly well. They do other things that maybe we don't like, but that's just one of their strengths. But modern democracy, within the context of the nation state, it invites those kinds of concerns because, again, there's an exclusivity. Canada is a good example. Just in the sense that Canada has a very generous welfare state, but in order to enjoy those benefits, they can't be spread too thin. Now, and you would not see that kind of welfare state in places like Eastern Europe, perhaps. But there's still the question of, who represents whom, who gets what. So I do take your point, but I don't think that's causal. I think rather that's a factor that's simply built into the logic of the modern state, if that makes sense.
It's built into the logic of the modern state that you only want your tax revenues and the economic benefits that come from social services to go to people that are like you, that are part of your nation.
Yeah, but also the modern state is the one that actually introduced the possibility of getting those kinds of benefits. I mean, it's one thing. I mean, under a feudal system, for example, you're not benefiting from your tax revenues. They're just going to the dynastic lord whose property he claims you're on. These kinds of questions are opened up by the political settlement of the modern state.
Really? So that's interesting. So what that suggests is, back to my argument, if we have larger political entities that are sharing, like the European Union, social services more widely, nationalism will go away?
But that doesn't solve the problem. It just pushes back the borders, right? I mean, the Schengen Agreement, for example, doesn't do away with borders. It just extends the perimeter further out. And for example, when Angela Merkel in 2015 basically invited in approximately 1 million refugees, that was a crisis, not just as a result, that was a crisis not just for Germany, that was a crisis for, basically the whole of the EU, and was surely a contributing factor to Brexit. As people began to, again, as it opened up these questions, you still have these questions of who gets what, who lives where, who provides what security, can we trust X, Y, and Z people? So the EU is not really a resolution of that problem. It's simply a deferment of that question.
But isn't that better? Even if we, it's the old thing about perfection is the enemy of the good. If we can't have the whole earth as one nation, if we can have the G7, the European Union, the Western world, aren't we getting a little bit better?
Well, it's better if they can manage it well. I mean, certainly. I mean, look, having lived in Europe, I think it's a wonderful thing to be able to travel. You just walk across these borders with such ease, and to know that these people aren't about to slaughter each other as they have in past generations. That's a fine thing. And for that matter, I mean, we have a pretty easy border crossing between the United States and Canada. I think that's a fine thing. But but at the same time, the fundamental, you still have to answer questions of resource sharing. You still have to answer questions of security. And because those questions are tough, and because people don't always make the best decisions, this does open up questions of legitimacy, which is just a fancy way of saying trust. Do I trust these people to represent me and my interests, as opposed to the people over there? And as you start spreading that thinner, I think that's harder to manage. And I think I am less optimistic. I'm less bullish on the EU than I might have been in past years, partly because of the mismanagement. These questions still have to be managed by prudent leaders. The political problem doesn't go away, even if you find ways to kind of spread it out a bit.
I think that's true, but then I would argue having that common enemy outside is also really helpful for unification. And NATO and the European Union is more unified today than it probably has been in a long, long time because of the common enemy of Russia. And I do think that, you know, your point about management is very critical. I think about the pandemic and when Trump blocked some PPE from coming across the border, saying that we want the personal protective equipment and the ventilators and the vaccines for us first before we'll let Canada have it. And because of that, we got upset at the United States. We got upset at Trump, and the government here decided we needed to have local domestic supply. So, you know, bad management led to more nationalism.
It's a factor. I mean, you know, it's a balance, I think, that has to be struck. You know, I mean, for example, now I do think, you know, you look at we're starting to see a sort of backlash against some of the intense, I might say, passion that our elites in particular in both Canada and the United States seem to be feeling for the Ukraine cause, as people's own fortunes in North America seem to be going south. There is increasingly this question of, okay, but what about us? So I think that I think that this can go too far in either direction. And you could say, I mean, you might say a way of avoiding a nationalist backlash is by having a sort of prudential and decent nationalism, you know, one that addresses the real concerns of one's citizens and constituents, rather than kind of throwing it overboard in favor of various, you know, global or ideological missions. The alternative to that might well be a less decent nationalism rather than a genuine globalism. Just as, you know, the EU, the dream of the EU was not this sort of Schmittian, well, we'll just have another common enemy. The dream was we'll actually have a sort of peaceful settlement. So one way or another, these forms of nationalism, I mean, they're just very hard to get away from. And I think that's for structural reasons.
You use this term of transferred nationalism. What's that?
So that's really George Orwell's term, and he was observing the kinds of phenomena that he was seeing in the aftermath of the Second World War. It's not the only kind of nationalism, but is one that he pointed out was particularly intelligentsia types, intellectuals, are particularly susceptible to it because it allows them to exercise various passions that they have without feeling like, you know, they're so gauche and déclassé as to be, you know, ordinary patriots, ordinary nationalists. It's always some sort of more rare or baroque or exotic form of nationalism that seems to attract their interest. And even, I mean, I see it now. I see it now with some of the expressions of support for Israel on the part of American politicians, which, you know, seem to go beyond the requirements of supporting Israel itself. You know, when they start wishing for the crushing of everyone in Gaza, for example. That's not, first of all, that's not obviously an interest of anyone in the States. But also it is the expression of a kind of passion that they might not feel as comfortable saying. If they just said, well, I'm American, I want everyone in, I don't know, China or wherever to just, you know, get flattened. Which is not to say people don't say that,
but this desire, unless they're you know, Jewish or have a connection with Israel, isn't nationalism. This desire to crush Hamas and people in Gaza. It's something else, isn't it? It's repulsion with the heinous acts that were carried out on Saturday.
Yeah, there's some of that, but you know, it's a way of channeling through Israel as a foreign entity, assuming you're not, you know, Israeli. And I would say, as you know, speaking as a Jew, there are certainly, you know, Zionism, depending on how you personally process it, can certainly be a form of transferred nationalism. I've known many Jews that I would say expressed patriotic and nationalist feelings about Israel that they probably, particularly if they were liberal or leftist, would not have expressed with respect to the United States or Canada. Just take an example. That's not everyone, of course. So that's certainly another example of transfer nationalism.
Okay, so I come back and, you know, I want to ask you, is nationalism good or bad? You know, I think that, you know, what we're seeing with Trump over the course of the last 6 years, and some large parts of the Republican Party of the United States today is isolationism and nationalism that I think is negative. And you're saying, no, it's not negative, Brian. It's just reality.
It is reality, but can take negative form. Is what makes this tricky is that the particular, the sort of nationalist rhetoric of the Trump types is weirdly I wouldn't call it pacific, but it's not belligerent. And in fact, it's been critical of a lot of the war measures and activities of the warlike activities of the United States over the past couple decades. That's not to say that it actually issues in a positive program for drawing down or pursuing a more modest foreign policy. I haven't seen that particularly. But these are actually weird kinds of nationalism because because you have this very kind of MAGA rhetoric, but hasn't been coupled with a serious program for militarism, which is something we tend to associate with nationalism. By contrast, the anti-Trump types tend in many ways to be much more hawkish with respect to the situation in Ukraine and Russia, for example. Some of them are more hawkish in China. China seems to be a weird dividing line for a lot of people. So I think the next 10 years, I know I sound like Thomas Friedman, but the next 10 years will really be a strong test of how American nationalism, and for that matter, Chinese nationalism, can manage that potential challenge, the potential conflict between the two great powers.
How do you think we'll do?
I'm not super optimistic. The nuclear peace has done a lot of legwork. The nuclear peace has held up so far. We'll have to. It's impossible to tell. Partly because I don't think anyone anticipated, and certainly including people who should have known better. I suspect. I don't think anyone anticipated that Xi Jinping would be quite as nationalistic and belligerent himself as he was. I think a lot of people had high hopes that China would simply become more and more friendly, even as it grew wealthier and more powerful. I don't think that was a reasonable or realistic expectation. But
certainly, during Deng Xiaoping's era, that was, and the billion people or 750 million people that are coming out of poverty. The most people exiting poverty in the history of the world because of globalization and coupling and trade, et cetera, led to a lot of people thinking that was going to be what was happening. I'm a believer that the current leadership is primarily worried about power and the supremacy of the Communist Party, and so therefore they've lost the concept of prosperity for China, and it's just the prosperity for the Communist Party, and that's what's led to the current nationalism.
It's tricky. I mean, that tension was always going to be there, because there's no version of the party that could envision the good of China in the absence of the party. So that tension was probably inevitable. But at the same time, I think these sort of American, and not only American, hopes that growing prosperity in China would ultimately leave the party behind rather than strengthen its position. So far, those hopes have not come to fruition. And nationalism has served as a fairly strong glue between the party and the people, at least for the time being.
Is Putin a nationalist or an imperialist?
Oh, he's definitely a nationalist. I would say he's more of a nationalist than an imperialist. Not that the two are necessarily in tension with one another. One of the interesting things about Putin is that he's long very publicly been a critic of the Soviet Union because he believes that the Soviet Union was bad for Russia, which I think is an argument one can certainly make. And I think that one cannot understand his rise up to this point without being sensitive to the incredible costs that Russia bore in the 90s, just how devastating it was. I mean, on just about every possible metric, in terms of the standard of living, the rise in mortality rate, and so on. It was, the losses there were quite severe.
Caused by the fall of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Say again?
You're saying the problem in the 90s, so was that because of the cause of the breakup of the Soviet Union?
I would say it was a combination of the break. You had the breakup of the Soviet Union, and then you had all the various sort of sufferings endured by Russia during that period, partly as a result of mismanagement by its own leaders, partly as a result of a poorly managed transition to capitalist economy. And on balance, I would say that national patriotic or nationalistic Russians are far more aware of the American role in that part than most Americans are. I have a certain sympathy for that, which is not to say I have a sympathy for Putin's various aggressive designs. But I would say that most of it does seem to be fairly standard Russian nationalism and fairly consistently articulated fears about Russia's status and Russia's security. And those have been those go back many years. These aren't new. We've mostly disregarded them, and we're allowed to do that. But that sort of is how geopolitics works. It's not our job to manage Russia's problems, but here we are anyway.
We're chatting tonight with David Polansky about nationalism and whether, at least I'm trying to find out whether it's good or bad. And I think David's saying it is. Just hope that the people executing it are good. Interesting conversation. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with David Polansky. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is David Polansky. He's got a PhD in political science from the University of Toronto. He's an expert on modern nationalism. And I read some papers that he's written recently on this topic, and I thought it would be really fascinating to chat with him about it. David, I was, I guess, a globalist. I went and I got educated in the United States. I lived for a couple of years in the United States, went to a couple of different cities for work and business and life, etc., and then came back to Canada where I grew up. I traveled the world for business, Europe and Asia, etc. And I thought, the Washington consensus, capitalism, freedom, global trade were all good things. The World Economic Forum was a good thing. And a lot of those things have sort of gone out of favor. And we now have, a huge segment of our society to think the World Economic Forum is a way of some, elites trying to take over the world, funded by George Soros. And we have, some people thinking that globalization is terrible and we should reshore everything because we've, shipped all these jobs to Mexico and China, even though we're buying those cheap refrigerators and cheap cars and cheap stereos and things like that. And Shein is shipping, 747s over here every day filled with cheap ladies' fashion and men's fashion. So I guess this bothered me the most, I got to tell you, when I was working with Michael Ignatieff, who I thought was the best prime minister Canada never had, because he was one of the smartest individuals I've ever had the pleasure of interacting with. And I thought he would have been an incredibly capable individual. And he got destroyed by this line, just visiting, which was a very nationalistic line, saying, just because you can be a great professor in Europe and in Boston doesn't mean that you can come be a great prime minister in Canada, that you've got to have slaved through your whole political career in the backbenches of Parliament to be considered someone that's worthy of the prime ministership, at least in the terms of Stephen Harper, who at the time, who was labeling him as the just visiting individual. So I got to ask you, am I wrong that globalization was great and nationalism is bad, and or just smarter, more successful, capable political masters being able to move us toward this more nationalistic, less globalist world today, and this decoupling that was talked about this morning as a real negative to the prosperity of the world?
Well, you said a lot. I should preface my answer by saying, look, I'm a bad spokesperson for nationalism. Okay. I mean, like you, I've spent, look, I'm an American in Canada. I have a Canadian family. I spent most of my life living in other countries, living in Italy, living in China. I'm one of these, rootless cosmopolitans you hear about. And so I'm sort of personally sympathetic to the Ignatieff thing. But just on that point, let's say you are a voter. Your basic question, just from a democratic standpoint, not a nationalist, and I mean, it doesn't have to be a tribal thing. You have to wonder, does this guy represent me? I mean, this is supposed to be a representative democracy. Can I trust this guy? That's really the question, right? Can I trust that he's going to work in my interest and not for his own or his friends or his cousins or what have you? That's a big question. And I think it's a question that's unavoidably a democratic question, even though the answers can often be ugly. So I guess what I want to point out is, this is a bit of a flip side of the things we already like with liberal democracy. We're supposed to like, political participation and representation. We're supposed to think those things are good. This is a flip side of that, you know. So I think that it's not simply as simple as saying, oh, good and bad, as if these are different things. And similarly, I think with the sort of Washington consensus stuff, a lot of that was always underpinned by the power of one nation, the United States. And I don't want to open up the can of worms that is unipolarity and hegemony, because that's really almost would need to be its own radio show.
Oh my God, we get to come back again.
Anytime. But I mean, I think realistically, that was underpinned by, that it wasn't a bunch of people across the globe singing Kumbaya. It was one major power and then a variety of other stable, reasonably sturdy, reasonably powerful, usually pretty wealthy states acting in concert with it. You can call that globalism, and it certainly is less nationalistic than something like, a bunch of isolated, autarkic states squaring off against each other, like on a chessboard or something.
It wasn't globalization. It was American economic imperialism.
I'm not knocking it. But I think that the sort of globalization versus nationalism sort of dyad, I think it oversimplifies the sort of complexity of the situation and the way in which they flow together in key ways. It's not empire. I don't think that's useful to say, because when you compare it to what real empires look like. But it's also, it's not a post-national settlement. You're still very much in the world of certain nation states running the show as much as possible. And this is also very much, in this case, married to the question of, a handful of particular fiat currencies and the states that back them. It's not a pure transient kind of, world.
So I was going to ask you if we can do without nationalism. But I guess what you're going to say is nationalism exists. You just got to make sure that you manage it well. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I'm not saying by that it's inevitable or that we can never not have it. I mean, it's not always existed. There's probably always going to be forms of direct or preferred attachments. I mean, I don't believe you can really live in a world where you just don't prefer certain people or certain institutions over others. Where, again, go back to where you don't have the love of one's own. That doesn't have to take a national form, but for it not to take a national form would require a radically different political system than the one we have in the world right now. And I have to point out that the one we have in the world right now is heavily bound up with all the things we say we like liberal democracy and capitalism. So I would say we don't really have a version or even a vision of liberal democratic capitalism that is not bound up with nationalism and the nation state.
I've always thought of nationalism as akin to racism or prejudice against people of a different religion. But you're saying it's not.
Well, it could be. It's not that. It just doesn't have to be. I mean, one can be an American nationalist while still embracing, the various kind of races and ethnicities that are in America without insisting that American nationalism has to take an exclusive form. It's also, and I mean, this is another big question, what people sometimes call the sort of ethnic nationalism versus civic nationalism, different ways of being a nationalist. I find that a bit overblown, because it's not easy, right? I mean, you could say Japan is an ethnic nation. Well, Japan was an ethnic nation back when it was doing absolutely terrifying things back in the 1930s across China and, in the Pacific in the 40s. It's still an ethnic nation, but it's not terrifying anymore, as anyone who's been there knows. It's a very nice and genteel and well-ordered country. But it didn't become less of an ethnic nation. It's still very much the nation of the Japanese. Which I think is also apparent to anyone outside of there who visits it.
But it's also a global trader. It's also tied into the global community. It's also supporting peace missions and global war, peacekeeping wars, peacekeeping efforts worldwide, etc.
Sure. I mean, but its status as an ethnic nation, its status as as a very distinctive place for a very distinctive people, that's not necessarily exclusive with the possibility of, as you say, the economic globalism.
So is Make America Great Again good nationalism or bad nationalism?
It's not, it's very thin nationalism. I mean, it's a slogan, right? And what it captured, I think, for a lot of people was the feeling, I mean, look, Trump is above all an entrepreneur. And I think the entrepreneur in him recognized that there was a gap because you had people in both the Republicans and the Democrats. And there's probably another timeline, Earth 34 or something, where Trump went with Democrats. But I think what they had in common was they were sort of maybe a little bit gaslighting the American people, insisting that things were better than they were. I mean, literally, when Trump got on the stage of with the other Republicans back in 2015 and 2016, he was the only one who could say Iraq was bad. That was a really big mistake. I mean, just the ability to kind of carve out that moment, that was very entrepreneurial of him. And I think the MAGA summed up this way of saying, of letting people be able to say they weren't happy with the direction the country was going in. I say that it's pretty thin because it didn't actually amount to a clear set of policy directions. I mean, what were the distinctive Donald Trump policies? We have a very clear picture of what he was like,
A wall, and Mexico is going to pay for it.
Yeah, but in terms of the actual outcome, he
didn't build it, or at least didn't complete it, and Mexico certainly didn't pay for it.
Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of rhetoric. The rhetoric, I would say that aspect of his rhetoric was certainly nationalist, for sure. Although there too, leaving aside the ugliness of his rhetoric, the question, I mean, these basic national questions of who gets in, who should be part of America or Canada or any other country, those really are, I think, unavoidable questions. You can ask them in uglier or more decent ways. And I don't know, I mean, speaking as an American who came to Canada, like, it's not like Canada doesn't make it that easy to come in, and that's nice old Canada.
Come on, there's 1 million of immigrants last year. We've got per capita, one of the highest levels of immigration in the whole world.
No, that's true. But they still have their system. That, they want to decide who they let in and who they don't. I mean, there's 8 billion people in the world. And most of the people living in the world presently enjoy a lower living standard than the average Canadian. So surely, I mean, the presumptive number could have been higher.
Well, the difference is that we have this selection system versus the United States. They actually let in a comparable amount. It's just they come in illegally.
I'm not knocking. I'm not knocking the system, but I'm saying the system is still a matter of making choices, and those choices are, in a sense, national, and they still go to the question of who do we think is a Canadian.
Well, let's come back to this nationalistics in Canada, because I think that is a big issue that could play out in the next couple of years. Let's take a final break for some messages and come back with David Polansky talking about nationalism and national interests and Canada in our final segment in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is David Polansky. He's a political scientist, a PhD, U of T, studies nationalism, modern nationalism. And it's an interesting conversation. And I've been trying to pressure him to decide whether nationalism is good or bad. And he keeps on telling me it exists. It's just the people that are, I guess, operating within it and how they manage the nation state and the nationalism within it. But I got to ask you, we have a situation here where some people have been criticizing our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, as not being nationalistic and not having Canada's national interests at heart. And if there are, it's more of a climate change orientation and an Eastern Canada orientation versus the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre, who is more interested, they say, in national interest in Canada, more nationalistic, and certainly more interested in the West and natural resources and things like that. And so, is Trudeau too much of a globalist, and is Pierre Poilievre the appropriate amount of a nationalist?
Now you're trying to pin me down. The answer there is tricky because it really, I mean, it's hard to speak to this without making what sound like very political claims about, and then have to do with, one's evaluation of his premiership. I mean, do you think he's done a good job?
I think in some places he's done a good job. I think the management of the pandemic was smartly done. I think that the current housing crisis is something that the federal government should have as a major priority, and it hasn't had as a priority. And I think that's a mistake. I think that the increase in the deficit and the debt is a major mistake. I think the lack of exploitation of our natural resources is a problem, and we could have and should have done it in a less carbon intrusive manner. But I think that right now we've got the lowest inflation rate in the G7. So even if Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives want to argue that it's just inflation, well, then arguably having the lowest inflation in the G7 is actually good. We have added to our debt and deficit, but not as much as the United States has with the Inflation Reduction Act, which was really a debt increase act. And our unemployment level is one of the lowest it's ever been in history. So, if anything, we've got inflation because we got too many companies looking for people to work.
This is tricky, right? And because a lot of this, again, is just going to be down to how do you evaluate his record? And I think if you evaluate it on balance positively, then I don't think there's really then I think the question of the nationalism, globalism isn't that salient. If you evaluate it negatively, it becomes more salient, because then you start asking, well, to what degree is the mismanagement, or is his poor legacy, if you think it's poor, to what degree is that bound up with a failure to address Canadian national interests, or, as you say, to think too much like a globalist? Or I guess I think my favorite, the most amusing criticism I heard of him was, he thinks he's prime minister of Twitter. I think there's something there. I mean, I think there's maybe a word. I think that, when I look at the rhetoric, a lot of it does feel pitched to what you might call a kind of global elite audience. And this basically, and this definitely resonates with plenty of Canadians. The question is, does it resonate with enough Canadians to keep him in office? That would be his political question. The resource thing, to me, looks like a really good example of someone not thinking like a nationalist, simply because Canada is so resource rich. And it's just like, look, you guys don't have the biggest military, you don't have the biggest population, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have the world's most favorable climate, but gosh, you've got land, and gosh, you've got resources. And I think, to the extent that those have been downplayed by this particular prime minister and those around him, it does feel like this is someone looking toward Europe. If I were in a mean mode, I might say, he thinks he wants Canada to LARP as Belgium. But in order to really address this properly, you have to really articulate what you think Canada is and what you think Canada should be, and how you see that vision as according with the collective interests of the citizenry. That's actually a very hard thing for any leader, I think, to do for any country. I'm not sure that I could really say, without getting in too much into politics, and I'm not that political a guy when it comes to Canada, I'm still a newcomer, but I think you could say that he has not articulated that in a particularly successful manner. And to some degree and that's not just on him. I think there's an entire class of Canadian elites who have probably lost the habit of speaking in terms of national interests. And that's a hard thing to build back up again. That's a sort of a habit that one has to recultivate. But at the same time, you want to do it in a non-grotesque way.
So argue in favor of national interest, but don't become a nationalist.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. I mean, the alternative to national interests are going to be, elite interests, or factional interests, or particular geographical interests, or any number of other things. Interests are completely unavoidable. We're spirits in the material world. I mean, we're stuck with the interests. So I think being able to speak decently, but also prudently about those things goes a long way.
David Polansky, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting conversation tonight.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, whether you're in my nation or not in my nation, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody. Thank you, David.